In 1977, NASA decided to equip the Voyager 1 spacecraft with a cultural visiting card from the human race in the form of a 12-inch gold record. The music of Јохana Sebastијана Bach was an obvious choice for inclusion. One of the pieces on the disc was the first movement of the second Brandenburg Concerto. This token of the glory that human civilization can aspire to is now well on its way into outer space, but the circumstances from which it originated were in no way unusual.
The 6 Brandenburg Concertos owe their name to the fact that Bach sent a very beautifully copied manuscript of the 6 to the Margrave of Brandenburg, and in the foreword he refers to the fact that a couple of years before he had made the acquaintance of the Margrave, who invited Bach to send him some compositions.
In accordance with your Highness's most gracious orders, I have taken the liberty of rendering my most humble duty to your Royal Highness with these concertos, which I have scored for several instruments.
And in sending these 6 concertos to the Margrave, it's undoubtedly the case that Bach was hoping that maybe there was a possibility of his getting a good job there, a job which did not materialize.
We don't know whether Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg ever acknowledged receipt of these scores dispatched to him in 1721. Bach's biographer, Philipp Spitter, was the first to call the 6 works the Brandenburg Concertos, and that was in the late 19th century. The name suggests that Bach intended them as a set, but there's no evidence of this.
Now, we tend to think 6 Brandenburg Concertos, that Bach sat down and he wrote the first concerto, he wrote the second one, finally he had all 6 finished, and that was it. But that's not the way Bach worked in general. His collections, such as the Well-Tempered Clavier or the Orgelbüchlein, or in this case the Brandenburg Concertos, are actually a series of pieces that were written at different times, which at a moment when it was useful to him were put all together.
The first concerto draws on traditional musical depictions of the hunt. Hunting was a privilege of the aristocracy, so this is also a reference to the dedicatee. Bach makes prominent use of 2 hunting horns, and the fanfare motif they play right at the beginning of the first movement turns up again repeatedly in the other concertos. This is the so-called ruler's greeting, consisting of a triad plus a closing triplet. Alongside the horns, Bach's solo ensemble consists of 3 oboes, a bassoon, and a violino piccolo, or small fiddle.
The second movement is more meditative. Very much a kind of a state of mind rather than having a tune in it. It starts by asking a question. It arrives at an answer, but very unusual in the 18th century to start a piece with a question. The movements of it are also rather interesting because the typical Italian concerto has fast, slow, fast. And most of Bach's concertos follow that outline. In the case of this concerto, however, we have fast, slow, fast, and then a minuet. In some ways, the second concerto is the most spectacular to listeners because of its thoroughly unusual combination of soloists. In the case of this wonderful mixture, sometimes the trumpet has the main tune, sometimes it's the recorder, sometimes it's the oboe, sometimes it's the violin, and listening to the combinations is wonderful. And in this extraordinary first movement, which has a main tune of a fanfare quality, this idea of taking the basic chord and turning that into a celebratory affirmation. What's fascinating about this is, whereas in the world of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert and Schumann and so on, a piece of music begins at home, goes away, endures a series of adventures and comes home. Bach's movements are a tour of the universe. The second movement dispenses with the trumpet and is a very intimate kind of dialogue between the three remaining soloists, with the cello just playing the accompaniment. And that's all. After that meditation and that intimacy, it's the trumpet by itself that starts a fugue-like jubilation, which is the last movement.
The instrumental concerto originated in Italy. The word concerto comes from the Latin concertare, meaning to vie or compete. It thus refers to one essential characteristic of the genre, the contest between rival instruments. In Italy, two different kinds of concerto developed, their best-known exponents being Antonio Vivaldi and Arcangelo Corelli.
Corelli has a way of writing concertos in which you have a body of instruments, that is, the tutti, several violins playing on each part, several violas, cellos, and then you have a concertino, you have a small group of soloists. Vivaldi, on the other hand, writes for the most part a concerto for one instrument or two instruments with an orchestra. And that's the model which Bach mostly used.
Bach first heard Italian instrumental concertos after 1713, when he was employed at the court of Weimar. He was particularly struck by Vivaldi's violin concertos. His Brandenburg Concertos take their bearings from the Italian model.
But we see, I think, that what Bach is trying to do here is not to write a series of concertos in a similar mold, the way Corelli did, the way Handel did, and indeed the way Vivaldi did, but to say, as Bach often did, I'm going to sum up the most interesting ways there are to write concertos. You can do this, you can do that, you can do this. And he says to the Margrave, he calls them 6 concerts avec plusieurs instruments, 6 concertos with several instruments. And no 2 concertos have the same scoring. The third concerto is very, very special because it's written, in fact, for 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, a bass, and a keyboard. So in fact, it's written for 11 musicians. It is not an orchestral piece, although it is often played by orchestra. What's really radical about this piece is that although it's written as if it's in a regular meter, and almost all 18th century music is based, by the way, on dancing. It seems like it's in 4. Bach tells you it's in 4, but actually it's not, because it goes. Now, if our listeners try to count and go 1, 2, 3, 4, they're going to find out that often the accent is on the wrong syllable. In other words, it's like a piece of contemporary music, and every bar is in a different meter.
The second movement, Adagio, consists of nothing more than 2 chords, which may be either an invitation to improvisation or a simple transition to the last movement. The third movement of the concerto is entirely different in character.
The last movement is another extraordinary case of motor energy. And here, instead of using the trios of 3 violins and 3 violas and 3 cellos, always as soloists, we get more of a sense of tutti playing.
The fourth Brandenburg Concerto begins with the longest movement of the whole set.
Very, very explicitly dance-like in character. And the presence of the 2 recorders is a pastoral element, because usually you hear recorders in Bach's sacred music when he's talking about shepherds minding their flocks of sheep. So immediately the sense of those two recorders brings us out into the open air. And on the other hand, you have the virtuosity of being in cities by this extraordinarily demanding violin part. Unbelievable virtuosity for Bach's time. Now, what happens in the finale of the Fourth Brandenburg is really one of the most spectacular moments in the entire series, because what Bach does is he writes an enormous fugue for the entire forces. And the fugue uses as its basis a figure which is absolutely standard for the time. You don't start with the main note of the scale, you start with the fifth note of the scale. And you jump from the fifth note up to the main note, which is an enormous act of affirmation. Then you hold it so it becomes not the consonants, the nice sweet sound, but it becomes suddenly a slightly weird sound, a dissonance, and that energy of the dissonance suddenly propels the piece forward, and we get absolutely ecstatic explosion of energy that comes by everybody getting into the act of doing this.
Bach probably finished his 6 concertos for the Margrave of Brandenburg in 1721. He was 36 and musical director in the service of Prince Leopold of Anhalt at the court of Curtin. He had an excellent orchestra at his disposal that was equal to the technical difficulties of his extremely demanding compositions. Bach's encounter with the Margrave that led to the compilation of the Brandenburg Concertos had taken place in the winter of 1718 and 19 in Berlin, where Bach had gone to choose a harpsichord for the court of Curtin. The instrument he selected was probably the one on which he first played Concerto No. 5. The Fifth Brandenburg Concerto is remarkable for its combination of solo instruments.
The consort of flute, violin, and harpsichord produces 3 instruments, each of which are so personal that the interplay between them is a source of delight. In this piece, which is one of Bach's most joyous, again, we have the cheerfulness and the motor energy that comes out of the basic chord of the movement. Which acts as the kind of opening tutti, and then the soloists start.
Bach wrote out the highly virtuoso harpsichord part in full. It culminates in a cadenza of staggering proportions, one reason why this work is referred to as the first keyboard concerto in history.
And all of the other instruments bow out and say, all right, you want to do something, go ahead and do something. And the harpsichord muses on all of the ideas that we've heard in the piece, in a sense. It's a kind of a dream. And Bach first wrote a shorter version of this cadenza and then decided to make it even longer and more spectacular. Then for the second movement, what does he do? He goes back to the soloist versus ensemble thing, and it's a quiet trio sonata movement for the harpsichord, the flute, and the violin. Very meditative piece in B minor, which is a wonderful key for the flute, by the way, which is probably why Bach chose this key. You know, he's always very, very clever. He chose F major for the horns because that's a good key for them. He chooses D major and B minor for the flute because it's the perfect key for the flute. Bach knew everything you needed to know about instruments. He made pieces for his musicians the way a Hong Kong tailor makes a suit for individuals.
For the third movement, Bach composes a concert fugue. Its theme is first presented by the soloists.
And then finally the orchestra comes in, and it goes in a series of episodes back and forth, tutti, solo, and it is a concerto, one of several that Bach writes, which is in an ABA form, which is to say he comes to a dead end at the end and comes back and then plays the opening section again.
We have no record of the performances of the Brandenburg Concertos during Bach's lifetime. The Age of Enlightenment was already underway, and the musical world at that time was greatly influenced by the new ideas it spawned. Composers were encouraged to eschew the opulence and the highly ornamental style of the Baroque in favor of greater simplicity and clarity. It's against this background that Johann Adolf Scheiber's criticisms of Bach's music in 1737 need to be regarded.
This great man would be the admiration of whole nations if he had more charm and did not ban all natural grace from his pieces by casting them in a confused and turgid style, thus marring their beauty with an excess of art.
Bach's mastery as a virtuoso organist and his immense contrapuntal skills were undisputed, and cycles like the well-tempered clavier were widely used for teaching purposes. But his orchestral works were less admired. Among his contemporaries, Bach was best known as cantor of St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. In the 80 years after his death in 1750, his music was hardly performed at all. After the revival of Bach's music by romantic composers like Felix Mendelssohn was it finally given the acclaim it deserved. The Brandenburg Concertos were first printed in 1850, 129 years after their completion. Bach probably wrote the last of the 6 Brandenburg Concertos in Weimar, which makes it the earliest work in the set. Its scoring is unusual, calling for 2 violas, 2 viola da gambas, cello and bass, and dispensing with violins and other high instruments. The solo parts are given to the 2 violas.
To talk about the B-flat concerto in terms of its instrumentation is also to say something about the fact that it lies particularly close to its Italian influences. It's very, very economical in terms of its material. It has a great deal of drive built around simple chords. Likewise, the middle movement, which is very, very meditative and relaxed, owes a great deal to its Italian forefathers. It has a kind of fugue-like opening, but very, very, very relaxed. And of all of the six, it has the effect of being the most antique. It seems to speak to us from the farthest away.
Orchestral music plays a relatively subordinate role in Bach's overall output. But here too his achievements were remarkable, greatly influencing the further development of the instrumental concerto.
His music has remained at the epicenter of what classical music is. And every generation reinterprets Bach. Bach is always modern. He's modern to Mahler, he's modern to Schoenberg. He remains somebody whose complete understanding and wisdom is absolutely extraordinary.
Bach's name should not mean brook, but ocean, because of the infinite and inexhaustible wealth of his tone combinations and harmonies. Bach is the ancestral father of harmony.
Bach is the beginning and end of all music.